Okay, this is an interview for the Vietnam War Oral History Project, and this is a little bit unusual. They can edit this out if they want to, but I'm interviewing my dad. My name is Russell Spivey, and the interviewee is going to be my father, who served in Vietnam and was also a career military officer. So we'll start with telling us some basic stuff about your name and where you live.
Okay, my name is Benjamin G. Spivey. I presently live in Newnan, Georgia, in a retirement community called Wesley Woods. Okay. I've been here about 2 years.
And phone number here is what? In case, I don't know if they want to call you, but don't worry about it.
The phone number here is 770-253-3878.
All right. And you don't do computer, so I want to ask about email. What's your birthday?
Birthday was 25 March 1929. And I was born in Alma, Georgia.
So that makes you
83.
So you just turned 83.
Just turned 83, right.
All right. And what branch of the service were you in?
I was Army Infantry.
Okay. And I guess the inclusive dates that you started and ended.
I was commissioned, first of all, from North Georgia College in 1950 and was called to active duty in June of 1951 and retired in June of 72, I guess, 71 or 72.
And when you say commissioned, what does that mean, to be commissioned?
That means that I had completed the ROTC work at North Georgia and was given a commission in the Army, commissioned officer.
Okay, so a commission as opposed to another type of service, which is what?
Enlisted.
Okay. So you have there's enlisted people who serve, and there are officers who serve, and the difference is the officers have commissions.
That's right.
And the government grants you the commission after a certain amount of education or something like that?
Right, after meeting certain requirements, yes.
Okay. This could take a long time, but just, as more or less in a list form, can you tell us about the units that you were assigned to during your career and maybe just where they were? I know that's 20 years of list, but
okay,
you started off in North Georgia College.
Okay,
you said
started off there. I was not called to active duty until the following year and was assigned to the 101st Division at Camp Breckenridge, Kentucky. And we were called in from New Orleans, Louisiana, and I spent approximately 6 or 8 months at Breckenridge with the 101st Division, training replacements for the Vietnam War, the Korean War. That's the Korean War. At that time, we were still under the draft system. We were not an all-volunteer force, so we were dealing with draftees. Okay, from there, I got orders actually to Korea with a TDY en route at Fort Benning for the Associate Infantry Company Officers Course. And this was 51 area, and then I was sent to Korea and was assigned to the 5th Regimental Combat Team, which was stationed on the demilitarized zone on the eastern side of Korea, north of the Punch Bowl area, which was north of Chuncheon. From there, I came, after my completed tour in Korea, I came to Camp Rucker, Alabama, and was assigned to a unit in the 47th Infantry Division, which was a National Guard division, which was activated from North Dakota, South Dakota area, and they reopened Camp Rucker as replacement area or replacement facility for Korea. Subsequently, the 47th Division was deactivated, returned to North and South Dakota, and then the division changed its name, and I was assigned to the 3rd Division, which moved to Fort Benning, Georgia. From there, I had various assignments to include a stint in the Infantry Officers Advanced class, and I was assigned then as an instructor at the infantry school for 2 years. From the infantry school, I went to Alaska and was assigned to headquarters Userall, U.S. Army, Alaska, as an assistant headquarters commandant. I also had a couple of other assignments while I was in Alaska. One was a special assistant to the commanding general, and one was a company commander for the battle group, which was stationed at Fort Richardson. From Fort Richardson, let's see, what did I do?
Was that Kansas after that?
No. From there, came on ROTC duty and was assigned to Georgia Military College at Milledgeville, Georgia. After the ROTC duty,
that was instructor in ROTC
that was
the college students,
instructor
right?
for 2 years from there. Yes,
Okay.
and then I was assigned to Leavenworth, Kansas, Fort Leavenworth, as an instructor in the Command and General Staff College.
That's called Command and General Staff College. All right.
And after that, I got an assignment to Saudi Arabia as a...
It's like an American advisor, would you say?
Well, I was assigned to the G3 section, which was the operations and training sections for the Ministry of Defense and Aviation at the Saudi headquarters in Riyadh.
Okay.
Shut that off just a minute. As an advisor in the G3 section of the Ministry of Defense and Aviation, I was the cohort, I guess, of a Saudi major who oversaw the training of the units in Saudi Arabia. So
Okay.
I went with him on several occasions to visit the troops or organization or operations during that period of time. From a career standpoint, it was a lost year, but it was a good year from the standpoint that I got to get into Jerusalem. I also had a trip to Tehran, Iran, and also to Isfahan, Iran. I got into visited Bahrain and had several opportunities to go out into Saudi Arabia, particularly down in the south part of Hamish Sheikh, which was an interesting experience. After the tour in Saudi Arabia, I was reassigned to Fort Leavenworth to the Command and General Staff College as an instructor, and I was there in the Department of Division Operations for 2 years. After that 2-year stint, which was very pleasant. I got my orders to Vietnam. At that point, most officers had a tour, or at least one, in Vietnam, and those who had not been to Vietnam were scheduled to go. So I was picked because I had not been.
Okay.
I didn't volunteer for that tour, and so I spent a year in Vietnam.
All right.
After Vietnam, I was assigned to the Assistant Commandant of the Northern Warfare Training Center at Fort Greely, Alaska. After a year at that post, then I decided to retire and return to civilian life.
All right. At that point, you had 20 years,
I had a little over 20 years in.
and you retired as a lieutenant colonel.
Retired as a lieutenant colonel.
Okay. So the dates of that you were actually in Southeast Asia was from when to when, pretty much.
Basically from 69 and 70.
All right. All right. And the unit, let's see, the unit that you were assigned to is called what?
The command unit was the 1st Field Force Vietnam,
Okay.
referred to as IFFV, and the IFFV had liaison personnel with the Korean units who were assigned to Korea. So I was assigned as a liaison officer to one of the regiments of the 9th ROC Division.
And when you say ROC Division, you mean
The Republic of Korea
Okay.
Division. So I was assigned with the
It's called White Horse. Is it White Horse?
it's a White Horse Division, and I'm trying to think of the regiment, but I can't think of it right now.
That's all right. Don't worry about it. Well, thinking back on it, why can you say just why did you join the military?
Well, first of all, I was in it, chose to participate in the ROTC at North Georgia College, and knowing that if I completed and was offered a commission, that I would take it, and elected to serve.
Okay. Was that a way to help pay for college? I know a lot of people do that now to pay for college. Back then, was it?
No,
Was it like
there
that?
was a little stipend for the last 2 years of ROTC, where we were paid approximately $30 or $35 a month to cover the cost of uniforms and books.
Okay.
But that was all.
At North Georgia College at that time, all the male students were military cadets, were they not?
Most of them.
Okay.
Some of the people who had come back from World War II entering North Georgia wore uniform, but they did not participate. They were not obligated to participate in the ROTC system. There were also a couple of 3 disabled persons who did not participate. But basically, all students, male students, wore the uniform and participated in ROTC.
But it was, in spite of that, though, it was a co-ed school. There were women.
It was
there too.
a co-ed military college,
Okay.
and there were a dormitory full of females at North Georgia.
Okay. Thank goodness, because that's where you met Mom, right?
That's where I met my wife, and we dated for the last 2 years that we were at North Georgia, both graduating in June of 1950.
Okay. Tell us where did you serve in Vietnam? Where was geographically, where was it located?
We were, first of all, the Koreans were basically assigned to coastal security from Da Nang all the way to Saigon. And my unit, the 28th Rock Regiment, which was a part of the 9th Rock Division, was assigned as security for the Tuiwa area, which housed an Air Force base, an artillery headquarters, and also some administrative units.
Okay. And what was your job description, or MOS, or what are they? MOS means what?
Military Occupational Specialty.
Okay. Did you have one of those, or?
Well, I was assigned as 1542, which was an infantry unit commander, and I believe that carried on through this period of time. But I was a liaison to the IFFV liaison to the 9th Rock Division, specifically the 28th Rock Regiment, which was stationed around Tuiwa Air Force Base.
Can you spell Tui? I mean, do
Tu-
you remember how to spell Tuiwa?
Tuiwa is spelled T-U-Y, capital H-O-A.
Okay.
He also provided security for a deep water port called Vung Ro Bay, which allowed ships to come closer to provide fuel for the Air Force units that were stationed at Tuiwa Air Force Base,
Okay.
and for the other units that used fuel.
When you look at a map of Vietnam and you see the division between North Vietnam and South Vietnam, I mean, approximately how far were you away from that separation? So how far was Tuiwa from the border between North and South Vietnam? Roughly, I mean.
Well,
We're talking about other end of the country, or we're talking about halfway?
the south end of Vietnam. Then we were about on the east coast, about halfway
Okay.
from the North Vietnam to Saigon,
Okay.
north of Cam Ranh Bay and south of Quy Nhon.
All right. Do you remember events or engagements or campaigns that were going on at that time? Like, they talk about the Tet Offensive, or they talk about, I guess that's what they mean, but did any of them have names that you can recall while you were there?
I don't remember the operational names. They had Korean names, of course, but they did run operations in and around there. TAOR, which is a tactical area of operations.
Okay.
And some of them were company-sized units operations. Some of them were regimental-sized operations.
Right.
If it was a regimental-sized operations, I went with the Rock Regimental Commander. Everywhere he went, I went.
Right.
It was not for the purpose of providing advice, but more or less liaison. The Rocks didn't need much advice to do what they needed to do, but sometimes they needed some coordination, additional support, such as helicopters or artillery.
All right. Did you receive awards or citations for your service in Vietnam?
Yes, I was awarded the Bronze Star for meritorious service, and also I was awarded a Korean citation, as well as the campaign ribbons for the Vietnam service.
Okay. Do you belong to any veterans associations now?
I'm a member of the Military Officers Association and also a member of the American Legion.
Okay. This is the training section. How old were you, and what was your hometown when you joined the Army?
Well, actually, my hometown is Quitman, Georgia, but when I graduated from North Georgia, I took a job as a claims investigator and adjuster with Liberty Mutual Insurance Company, and I was assigned to the New Orleans office, and I was called in from New Orleans.
So about how old were you at that point?
21 or 2, yeah.
Okay. And after you graduated from North Georgia College, you didn't have an obligation per se to the military. Is that right? In other words, you graduated and started on a civilian job, right?
Well, yes, I was commissioned a second lieutenant in the Army Infantry. I had an obligation, but didn't have an obligation to go in at that time. I chose to accept a reserve commission rather than go in directly.
Okay.
So after a year in civilian job market, then I was called in, and from there I stayed in.
And okay, did you expect to be right away in a shooting war?
Yes, I graduated from North Georgia in 1950. This was the middle of the Korean conflict, and I expected to go in, but I didn't know when. But I was subject to recall, and when my number came up, they called me in.
Okay. I guess most enlisted people go to boot camp or basic training, but your more or less basic training was combined with a college education at North Georgia, right?
Yes, and the ROTC program itself, but also most lieutenants who were coming in on active duty were sent to the Basic Infantry Company Officers course at Fort Benning, as far as the infantry is concerned.
How long a course is that?
It's about 6 months.
Okay.
But since I had been assigned to an infantry training division, I was sent to the Associate Infantry Company Officers course, which was a level above, but again about 6 months, and I was sent there en route to Korea.
Is that also in Fort Benning?
That's at Fort Benning.
Okay.
Now the other officers who were commissioned artillery went to Fort Sill as an example, or the engineers went to Fort Belvoir, wherever the basic classes for that branch of the service was where the individuals were assigned.
So what was that like, that 6 months? Was it physical, mental? Was it tough?
Well, yeah, we knew we already had orders for Korea, so we were bound to absorb as much as we could from that training in order to help us when we got to Korea. So it was, we tried to get everything we could out of it.
What was a typical day like? Tell us about your daily routine at that time, during that course.
Well, we had, first of all, we lived off base, off post, and depending on when the day started, we would have to assemble, and whether we were going on tactical exercises or classroom work, there were classes in supply, tactics, There was practical work in map reading and turn it off just a minute.
So you were talking about map reading as
There
part
were,
of
there were various classes that were conducted, but the basic mission was to get us ready to fulfill our mission in Korea. Thereby, we had tactics instruction. We went on small patrol activities. We qualified with the M1 carbine and also the 45 caliber pistol.
Do you think it helped you? I mean,
oh yeah, it helped.
do you think it also helped you? I mean, was that kind of stuff the stuff that would help an officer going into Vietnam? Same kind of thing, you think? If you had been at that stage of your career, and instead of going into preparing for Korea, if you had been preparing for Vietnam, would it have pretty much been the same thing?
I think it pretty much been the same thing, with emphasis in the Southeast Asia area of operations, and the history and customs and courtesies of Korea as well as Vietnam.
Okay. Well, question is, did that training change you in any way? But I mean, do you think it did?
Yes, it gave me added confidence on what I was supposed to be doing. But in Vietnam, this was a new concept, a new assignment. The Koreans were new at this. And the command structures for the Korean troops, Vietnamese troops, U.S. troops, and other UN personnel who were there, it was a little complicated, and the Koreans insisted on commanding their own units, but they were under operational control of the U.S. So we had to pretty much feel our way. I had to pretty much feel my way on what I was supposed to do.
Okay. So it required a lot of tact on your part, in other words.
It required a lot of tact and a lot of patience and a lot of work too to do what I thought I had to do. We were required to send confidential reports monthly to the Rock Division liaison officer, who was a guy by the name of Bud Liu, Colonel Bud Liu. And I think one of our missions as liaison officers were kind of to keep track of what the rocks were doing, because sometimes they went off on their own. So these were confidential reports that were sent through channels from our observations of what the Koreans were doing, what the unit was doing, what it had planned to do, and so forth.
Okay. All right, this is the combat experience part of the questionnaire. You said you didn't volunteer to go to Vietnam, but you were assigned from Leavenworth because you were one of the officers there who had not been yet.
That's correct.
So did they just kind of go through and see who hadn't been? Was it a career enhancement to be sent to a situation like that, you think?
Well, I guess the Army felt like it needed to have as many officers as possible to go through the experience of Vietnam. Of course, at that time it was beginning to get unpopular, but any war is unpopular.
Tell us how you felt. How did you remember how you felt when you first learned that you were going to get sent there? I mean, I know you had to be apprehensive, right?
Very apprehensive. Of course, I had the family involved, and this was important to me, and I was having to leave them at a critical stage in my children's lives. So that's one of the reasons I did not volunteer. But since I had accepted the commission and the obligation when they said go, I went, and we adjusted accordingly.
So, our family, I mean, you had four children, of which I'm the last. But at that time, my oldest sister, Beverly, was in high school, right?
She was a junior in high school, I believe.
Okay.
And the family opted to stay in Leavenworth, the city of Leavenworth, so that Beverly could graduate from high school, which she had been going to for 2 or 3 years anyway.
Okay.
And had developed ties. And
Right.
the youngest daughter was in junior high,
All right.
and also had developed.
All right. And so your second daughter, my older sister, was in junior high at that time, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
And then you had 2 boys.
Yeah.
Bruce was in, I guess, elementary school,
Yep.
and I was in 2nd grade.
That's right. First and second grade.
All right. And that's when Mom went back to work in her lab job at the hospital, I think, during that year. Is that right?
I believe that's right. In order to supplement income, she decided to get back into the workforce and applied for a job in the laboratory at, can't think of the name of the hospital now, but it was a civilian hospital in Leavenworth.
Okay. And I imagine she was pretty worried about you going, right? That's an understatement, probably.
Yeah,
Isn't it?
that's an understatement.
Okay. The question here is: were you in a combat or a combat support unit? How would you answer that?
I was a liaison to a combat unit, and as such, I participated in operations that the ROCs participated in.
Okay.
And I actually accompanied the infusion, I guess, of a ROC battalion into an area of operation by helicopter. And I rode flew in the command helicopter that put those people in, or directed them from the helicopter operations.
Okay.
Get them inserted is what I.
Okay. What kind of weapons did the unit use, and do you think they were adequate for the type of action that they were involved in?
Well, the ROCs used normally the same weapons that the U.S. forces used, to include automatic weapons, mortars, and artillery. And yes, I think they were adequate for that type
And
operation.
you said they were supported, if they could call in air support or helicopter support if they wanted to?
If they had helicopters that were in direct support of the ROC unit, and they could also, through the regular channels, call in the Air Force air support, which they did on many occasions.
Okay.
The F-4's Phantom jets were stationed at Tuiwa Air Force Base, but if they called in a mission, wherever the unit was that could support that, they used, whether it was F-4 Phantoms or whether it was some other aircraft.
Thinking back on your first encounter with the enemy, can you describe that, where you were, what circumstances were going on?
This is my personal contact
Yeah.
with the enemy was in Vietnam or Korea now.
Well, I think this is really focusing more on Vietnam.
Okay, I was never in direct contact with the enemy, but I was with the ROC commander as he oversaw operations for his regiment.
Okay.
And they took prisoners, they confiscated weapons, they rounded up casualties, and but I was never in a direct contact with the Vietnamese.
Okay. What about how would you evaluate the North Vietnamese overall fighting ability, their overall strengths and weaknesses?
Well, I don't have any first-hand knowledge of the North Vietnamese, but they,
From what you saw, or
and saw and observed, they were expert in guerrilla operations, small unit operations. They did not want to fight fixed battles, but they were excellent in small unit harassing type ambush operations, and they also were good at intimidating the civilian population to get them to support their cause.
okay. What do you know? What sorts of equipment and weapons did the enemy or North Vietnamese used? In other words, I guess what kind of weapons that the ROCs ended up capturing from them?
I think that primarily Russian and Chinese-made weapons, either rifles or machine guns or rockets or whatever. Most of them were Chinese or Russian-made.
Question is asking you to describe the bravest action, either friend or enemy, that you might have witnessed while you were in Vietnam.
But I'm not saying that now.
Well, okay. But you can generally talk about, why? You were assigned as the American liaison to the ROC troops. Why was the ROC? Why were Korean troops in Vietnam in the first place?
Well, they wanted to. Are you on?
Yeah.
Well, they wanted to participate, and they were very eager to get their units, both Marines and infantry units and artillery units, rotating into Vietnam and out, and they had their own rotation system, and they were eager to get as many combat experienced personnel as possible, because their overall goal was to unify North and South Korea. And their aim and goal was to move north and take over North Korea and unify it into one country.
So in other words, you're saying that by experiencing and gaining the education experience that they might get in Vietnam, it was preparing them to go back and fight in their own country to get the country back, to take the North back.
That's right, and they had a very good rotation system, replacement system that would get as many people with combat experience into Korea as possible.
Okay. How did they feel about the Vietnamese?
They didn't like the Vietnamese. They thought they were underhanded and undercover. They didn't trust them. Of course, one of the characteristics of Koreans is they don't trust anybody much except themselves. And
why did they feel that way about the Vietnamese? Do you know? I mean,
I don't know what the deep-seated
what was
feeling
the
was
source
there.
of the enmity between the countries, you reckon?
I don't know. I can't answer that.
Did you bring any personal weapons with you did you have any, I mean, when you went out with them, did you carry anything?
Yeah, I carried a .45 pistol loaded with additional ammunition, always.
Okay.
Even when I went to meetings, which were attended by Koreans or Vietnamese or whatever. We had meetings in the district and the province, and I always carried a weapon, as did my driver. He carried his weapon.
Okay. Did you ever have to fly helicopter or any other aircraft in Vietnam?
I didn't fly them, of course. I wasn't qualified to fly helicopters, but yes, I flew frequently in helicopters, and whenever the ROC regimental commander went anywhere, he went by helicopter, and I was with him, as was an interpreter. And just a sidelight, I had a regular helicopter type flight helmet that could hook into the communication system in the helicopter, and I could talk to them. And the interpreter that was assigned to me was also with us too. Although the ROC regimental commander spoke some English, the interpreter was always there to coordinate between the liaison and himself.
Do you think your interpreter was, I mean, did you like him? Did you trust that he would tell you exactly what the regimental commander said and vice versa?
You had to assume that he was telling him what I said, and the regimental commander was, I had to assume that he was telling me what the regimental commander wanted. So the results indicated that was true.
Okay. But having an interpreter was like, I mean, it wasn't just an interpreter for that particular event that might have been going on at the time, but it was somebody that was more or less assigned to you for a lengthy time?
With me. He was with me all the time.
Okay.
Whenever I went out with him, and I flew a lot of helicopters. In fact, one requirement that the helicopter people had on night operations was that they would not go in without the U.S. liaison officer with them. This was particularly true for the dust-off operations, where they had to go in at night and pick up a casualty, a ROC casualty, and bring them back to their medical facilities. Would not fly without the U.S. liaison officer and the interpreter going with them.
Did that cause you some
And
anguish?
that would cause me some anguish, but that was part of the job, and when they said go.
You told me one time, I think it was an irritating thing happened one time where somebody called for a dust-off that you had to participate in because of what you just said, and it turned out that it really wasn't somebody that was in dire need of a helicopter.
Well, that was happened before they required me to go with them. They were called into the dead of night, into a night landing into the ROC compound, which was out in the boondocks, and it wasn't really necessary for them to go. From that time on, they required the U.S. liaison officer to go.
Oh, I see.
With the helicopter.
So
I was briefed.
in other words, if you had to go, it better be serious.
That's right.
Okay. All right. Did you ever have occasion to evaluate any of the South Vietnamese fighting ability, or were you totally pretty much separate from them?
No, we were pretty much separate. The ROCs operated in their own area of operations, and I never had any contact with Vietnamese troops at all.
Okay. How would you evaluate? This is sort of asking almost a self-evaluation, but the question is American military leadership in Vietnam, of which you were a part, and your commanders, I guess, that you had maybe in the field. How would you say that was effective, ineffective? Looking back on it now, do you have an opinion?
I would say we were effective, and I can't comment on U.S. troops because I was not participating with U.S. troops.
Right.
But I can comment on the ROC troops who were eager to get there. They were eager to get the combat training and experience. They were given a mission, and they followed their commanders without question. They did what they were told, and they did an excellent job of going in and clearing areas of operations, capturing people and equipment, and they did a good job.
What generally was the NVA or the North Vietnamese attitude? You hear a lot about, them the fight that they might have had with the American troops or whatever. But how did they feel about the ROC troops, or tangling with them as opposed to anybody else?
Well, just from secondhand information, the North Vietnamese military, and particularly the civilians, feared the Koreans very much. But the Koreans had to work on, if they went into a pacification process, they had to go in and get the confidence of the civilians, but still there was animosity, there was untrust between the Koreans and the civilian Vietnamese civilians. And the North Vietnamese, from my reading and secondhand observation, I guess, was they were afraid of the ROCs. They didn't want to mess with them too much.
Okay. Did you have to participate in civilian construction, or did y'all do anything, did the ROC unit, I guess, do anything for the civilians in the area, like infrastructure or anything like that for them?
Yes, they did. The ROC battalions were situated so that they would go in and assist the civilians wherever they could, and protect the civilians so that they could carry on their commerce or farming or whatever they needed to do under some semblance of security, and they did a good job of it.
What do you think was the most difficult aspect of your your leadership position as an officer? What was the hardest thing to contend with when you were over there? Was it just the fact that keeping the communication between the Korean regiment and versus the U.S. going smoothly, or what was the most difficult aspect of it, you reckon?
I guess the biggest problem was the language. Of course, I didn't speak Korean, nor did I speak Vietnamese, and had I been able to speak Korean, it would have been a lot easier for me, and I probably could have been more effective had I been able to do that.
Okay. Why do you think the United States was involved in war in Vietnam? I mean, there's a.
I think we were there to curb the communist aggression, particularly the Chinese, from expanding their influence in the Southeast Asia, which we had a lot of interest not only in Vietnam, but Korea, Thailand, and if the Chinese overtook the Southeast Asia area, expanded their realm of influence, then it would cause us problems, and with not only with us, but also with our allies.
So that's kind of the big picture of the why we were there is what you just said.
To shore up the South Vietnamese so that they could run their own country. Obviously, we didn't accomplish that because we got out under
kind of bad circumstances.
And a lot of it, I think, was due to civilian influence, non-support of the troop and the mission, and it was difficult to try to come up with a clear-cut mission of why we were there.
As a person, you were how old approximately when you went over there, when you went to Vietnam? You had 4 children by then, but so you were in your 30s?
30-ish, mid-30s.
Did you? You feel like you personally believed that more or less the party line, or at the time, you think you might have changed, that opinion might have changed over time, or tell it.
Well, I had to beat the drum. I had to follow orders,
right,
and do what I was told to do because of my military status. And I had to sometimes curb my personal feelings in order to accomplish what I was told to accomplish.
Right. Okay. Did you think, so you had an outward aura that you had to present to others in the military and troops that might have been below you, or whatever. You had that.
Yes.
But you also had your personal beliefs and feelings about whether or not
it was a good idea had to be put on hold, or had to be stymied somewhat, so that it would not contradict what I was supposed to be doing.
Okay. Okay. Okay, this is the in-country section of the questionnaire, and the first one is, what did you think of the native population of Vietnam during your time there? How much contact did you have with them? Did your opinion of them change over the time you were there?
I had very little contact with the Vietnamese. The country was hot, they were poor, they were destitute, they were eking out a living, they were trying to raise their families and do their jobs just like anybody else. But I had very little personal contact with them. but the rocks tried to help them somewhat and provide security so they could make a living and live their lives.
Do you think they needed help from the rocks?
I think they needed security from the.
What was the threat?
The threat was the Vietnamese, VC, Viet Cong, who would infiltrate into villages and towns and scavenge food or valuables or whatever, and they needed security to provide, to keep them out, to keep the VC from infiltration.
Well, you hear those terms are thrown around sometimes that maybe need some defining. I mean, is there a difference between VC and NVA, North Vietnamese Army? What is that?
Well, I think the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, was more or less an organized militia type thing. The VC were infiltrators, they were guerrilla operators, they were, I guess there was some coordination between the NVA and the VC, but from the rock standpoint, they were all enemy, they were all VC. And I don't know, I can't think of an instance where I observed the rocks being in direct contact with an NVA unit. There might have been. My area was very small in overall comparison of the whole country. But the VC would sneak in, and this was what the rocks were trying to provide security for the population so that they could live their lives. That's
okay.
There were some Vietnamese work personnel who lived in the rock compound who did menial tasks such as laundry and yard work, I guess, help with fences, but I had very little contact with the Vietnamese.
Was there any real way to tell either language or the way people wore clothes or the way they might have spoken? Was there any real way to discriminate or distinguish between somebody who might have been VC or somebody who might have been South Vietnamese villager? Was there anything like that you could?
I don't know of anything that could distinguish from outward observation or listening, from language or whatever. I don't know of any.
Do you think the rock commanders or troops were able to make that distinction? From being both Oriental type people, I mean, do you think that's more apparent to them, maybe?
Well, it might have been, but I don't know of any specific thing. The rocks knew the rocks, and anybody else was an enemy.
Okay. How did you get to what was your transportation like the first time you landed in Vietnam? And did you land at a regular airport in a jet, or how did you get there?
We is a regular contract MATS aircraft. I don't know what airline it was, but they had all kinds. Pan American, TWA.
Do you actually have a memory of the time?
Not much of a memory, except it was a long trip from McCord Air Force Base into, I think we landed at Tan Son Nhut, and were processed there. When I got out, it was hot, hot, and we had to turn in what clothing we had and draw our fatigues and weapons and necessary combat equipment. At that point, before we were assigned to Nha Trang, before we got into Nha Trang, which was the headquarters for the liaison, the 9th Division liaison office.
And internal transportation for you while you were in Vietnam, was that primarily helicopter?
Primarily helicopter, but sometimes if it were short trips by jeep, if we were going to the province headquarters or to the next door units, they had an artillery headquarters and an engineer unit and some other support units in the Phu Hip area. Was by jeep.
Okay. What were your living conditions like when you were there?
My living condition was very good. I had a little, what we call a hut, which was actually a 1-bedroom apartment building, which had indoor plumbing, which had a bed, had air conditioner. Although the shower facilities were done by immersion heaters that were mounted on top of the building, and if you had to heat the water, and then by gravity the water would come out. When I say indoor plumbing, actually was a hole in the ground, but you had a commode and sink. And
did you ever have to go when you went out with the troops, like you said earlier? Was that were those times that you would stay out for any extended length of time, or what it might be a couple nights that you had to go out with them, or was it always something that you could come back to?
No, if the unit stayed on a 4 or 5 day operation, then we packed to stay.
What were those conditions like when you had to camp, basically?
Primitive. The rocks would dig me a bunker, and I had my cot and lantern and so forth. But they provided that as they did for their own rock commander. But there was a hole in the ground and protected, and overhead cover if that was required, or I was provided a tent if that was appropriate. But they took care of me and provided me not only food but protection as I went out with them.
Was anything fun or entertaining while you were there?
Yeah, I had direct contact with the aviation unit that was stationed next door, and the artillery unit, and there were individuals that we played poker and bridge with, mostly poker, and there were officers' clubs at Tuiwa Air Force Base, which was pretty good facilities, and it was a regular club.
And I think the Koreans, from the pictures I've seen, they were very much into the Taekwondo kind of thing. Do they have demonstrations about that?
They had the Rocks had their own USO type facilities and personnel, and they toured the Rock units just as our USO people toured our units. And I did go to see those shows, and I was welcome. I usually sat with the Rock commander or right behind him, and the Rock interpreter sometimes was with me, Although I couldn't understand the language, the music and the beauty and the presentation was always very good. And
were any of the ROC troops or commanders conversant with you in English besides the interpreter?
to some degree, they were limited in English, as I was limited in what Korean I could pick up, and we had fun communicating or trying to communicate.
If you had known 6 months to a year before you had that assignment to be the liaison officer to Korea, could the Army have done anything to prepare you better for that assignment?
Yes, I think so, but it would have taken some real foresight, because the Army runs a language school at Monterey, California, and we had, particularly going back to Saudi Arabia, we had people who were assigned to that mission who had spent a year in language school at Monterey prior to going to Saudi Arabia. If it were possible for liaison personnel or any military personnel who were going to be assigned to foreign troops, if they could get them into language school, yes, it would have been a tremendous advantage, I think.
The next questions are about, the most memorable event or the most humorous event that happened while you were there.
Probably one of the most memorable events was that I wanted to participate with an Air Force pilot flying his A-10 when he went in to put in an airstrike. Those planes were, of course, tricycle landing gear, top wing, with the smoke rockets mounted, and
Jet or propellant?
No, propellant.
Okay.
And those Air Force personnel stayed in the rock compound. So one time when he was going to put in an airstrike, I wanted to go with him just for the experience to do that. And it was a two-seater.
Side by side, or?
Side by side. And there was some communications, and the guy would go in and mark the target with smoke, and then the jets would come in and either drop the bombs or napalm or whatever. But that experience was exhilarating. I was sick as a dog in the air, but I didn't want to go again, but that was a memorable experience for me.
Did you encounter any type of racial or, I know it was a different world back then, a different time, but racial, social, rank discrimination is the question. Did you see that?
The ROCs were very rank conscious, and they were very conscious of the commander, the ROC regimental commander, and their battalion commanders, and on down. And there was no question of who commanded what in the Korean unit. And whatever that guy said went, and without question, unquestionable obedience to what he did or what he ordered.
Now he had the ROC commander had his own staff, including a driver, right?
Oh yeah, they had their own. It was similar to our command, a regimental commander, an exec, a staff, S1, 2, 3, and 4, and then the liaison section, which I was a part with the interpreter.
How did he treat his people?
As long as they stayed in line, he treated them fine. As far as I could determine now.
Well, what happened when things did not go according to his plan, maybe?
Well, with the Oriental Mine, they kept their dirty laundry pretty much hidden, and I didn't see much. There was one time when there was
when you hear, I guess, music or songs from that era, I mean, what do you have something that sort of, when you hear it, it brings back memories for you? I mean, did you?
No, I don't have any specific memories of the music era of Vietnam. I got kind of used to the Korean music, but I didn't know what they were saying, and I don't have any particular.
What about your correspondence with family or people back in the U.S.? I mean, did you have opportunity to send and receive letters and anything
frequently,
else?
and also we had through the Mars system telephone calls.
What is Mars system?
And the military.
It's an acronym for something.
Yeah, but I can't think of
Okay.
Military Airways. It was through the civilian ham radio operators, and I think you should remember that.
I do.
Because
Remember Mom saying over? Or,
yeah.
You know.
When you finish, you had to say over so that
You could click
the
it on.
radio, the ham radio operator could click off whatever they do to get the transmission going.
How often did you get to do that?
Probably once a month, once or twice a month or so. Yeah.
Other than that, was it strictly
But
letters?
the bad part about it, that due to the time deals,
Oh yeah.
we had to go to the Mars station, and it may be 12 or 1 o'clock in the morning, and wait for a couple of 3 hours before they could get the thing coordinated with y'all in Leavenworth.
Because literally other side of the planet.
That's exactly right.
Did you keep a diary or journal when you were there?
No, my only diary, I guess, was this confidential report that was sent monthly to my boss in the Trang, who was the 9th Regimental Rock Division liaison, which we were required to do. And I think I mentioned this earlier, that we were just there. If we saw unusual things, we had to report.
Was this a questionnaire you filled out, or was it just up to you to tell whatever?
Yeah, tell whatever, and in written form. And
how long was that?
As long as you needed. As long as you
Typically, what?
Probably 3 or 4, maybe 5 handwritten pages.
Okay. Are those
but
reports still? Do they even exist anymore?
Oh, I don't know that.
Okay.
There was only one copy, and I couldn't keep a copy, nor did I keep a diary. Probably should have, but
You didn't keep
we
one
were
because
told not to.
Huh.
It was forbidden, but I could have clandestinely, I guess, kept a diary, but the order was to no diary, so I did not keep a diary.
Okay. Did you know when you got there, did you know it was going to be a year exactly? Did you know, from the time you set foot in Vietnam, you knew at so-and-so time next year I'll be home?
Yeah, it was a year tour.
Okay. And I guess when that was approaching, how did you feel?
With great anticipation to get out of that place. It was.
Did you have any problems when you hear a lot about problems with troops or people in uniform coming back to the country after Vietnam? Was there any bad experience when you arrived back? Where did you fly into the United States after?
We flew into McCord Air Force Base by way of Hawaii, and from there I got a civilian plane to Kansas City, and Mom met me in Kansas City.
When you landed in a civilian location, did you have any problems with people? Did people say any bad things or did you have any bad experiences with someone who might have been opposed to you being there?
Other than this being ignored, I guess, the American people primarily were not back of the Korean War, nor were they back in the Vietnamese War. So, and I don't think anybody cared unless they had a loved one or a relative in Vietnam. I don't think, basically, if they had no connection, they went on about their job and hoped it would go away.
Have you had occasion to visit the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, or the traveling one?
Yes, I have been to the Vietnam Memorial in Washington. I was rather awed by it, although I had no relative or friend whose name was etched in that wall. So I didn't have a sentimental reaction to it. I was impressed with the odds and ends of stuff that was placed at the base of that wall, from cigarette lighters to boots to flowers to anything. And I did observe the names, and the memorial itself was impressive, but I didn't feel felt sorrow, felt bad for those people who had lost their lives in Vietnam, but I had no direct contact with any of them, because none of them I knew or had any personal contact with.
When you were with the Rocks as liaison, were there, other than your driver, was there any other American there on a daily basis that?
Yeah, I saw Americans on a daily basis with the artillery unit headquarters that was next door. The aviation battalion headquarters was next door.
Okay. When you say next door, what do you mean?
Well, you go out of the rock compound, which was surrounded by barbed wire, and you go through sentries, and down 200 or 300 yards was you go into another compound, which had security gates, and we had PXs, and we had what else did we have? Had a dental unit there, but I made friends with them, with those people, particularly the artillery and the aviation helicopter battalion headquarters. Good folks.
A couple questions about Agent Orange. Did you know what that was at the time? Or was
I knew what Agent Orange was. I was not in Vietnam when they used it. How the VA has ruled that you get 30% disability even if you were not exposed. They assumed that if you were in Vietnam, you had some exposure to it.
Okay.
And the VA awarded part of my disability as a result of Agent Orange.
But was Agent Orange used? It wasn't even used when you were there, or it wasn't used around you?
It had been used.
It had been used.
But it had been banned by the
Okay.
time I got there.
Okay.
Or not banned, ceased. They ceased using it.
With Vietnam, I mean, broadly, this is a question of, how do you think that your experience in Vietnam might have affected your life and your religious beliefs?
I hated it that it was had a year apart from my family. It didn't affect my religious beliefs. As a matter of fact, I even attended Korean church. The songs some of them I were familiar with, and I participated with them from a personal standpoint, and also from a show the face, seeing that I was interested in it, and noticed that church services were full, and they always ushered me to a seat on the front bench.
When you say church services, it was Korean language, but was it denominationally Christian faith based?
Yes, it was a Christian faith based church and service, and I think it was primarily Methodist, but I can't remember. But when church services were there, I was there to show that I was a part of it, and I could sing along with some of the songs that I remembered, but of course I didn't understand the language.
What would the traditional, religion be for Koreans if they had not been exposed to some mission type thing from the U.S. or from the West? What would they grow up? What would a typical Korean person? Do you know? What is their national?
I don't know. I don't know.
Okay.
I just don't know.
You mentioned, of course, being more conversant in Korean. But the last question is, if you had your Vietnam War experience to do over again, what, if anything, would you have done differently?
I'd do everything I could legally do not to go. I haven't lost anything, I didn't leave anything in Vietnam. I don't even want to go back for a visit. I don't care about it, and I would do everything I could legally do to keep from going.
What would that have been as an officer?
Well, you could put in a request to go somewhere else, or be reassigned, and.
But you did it. You went without question. You were told to go, and
I went without question. When
I'm
it was
going.
time for me to go, I went, even though it was. I can remember right now walking down that ramp at Kansas City Airport, looking back at y'all, and I'd do everything I could legally do not to go.
All right.
But if I wanted to go, I'd go. That's.
I understand. Well, that's it. That's all.